Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Far Cry 4 for PC, Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. This is a first-person shooter and the sequel to Far Cry 3. It was developed by Ubisoft Montreal and released in November of 2014, and is generally regarded as a success. It sold pretty well and got pretty good review scores across the board, although quite a few people did mention that it was a bit too similar to Far Cry 3 and that it didn't really innovate enough. But there were, of course, other issues that people had with it. I do remember there being a bit of a hubbub over the cover art when it was revealed, and people thinking it was outright racist when it turned out that the character who appeared to be white was in fact not white. So other than that, there wasn't really all that much leading up to the game that was particularly interesting. They pretty much just retreaded the Far Cry 3 ground, pushing the main antagonist as the big focus for it. But then the game came out and it was something a bit different from what people really expected. And that begs the question of what they did with Far Cry 4 that did alienate a few people, but generally speaking was considered a progression of what Far Cry 3 did rather than a new game entirely. Let's find out. Well, as far as presentation goes, it's pretty much what you would expect after having played Far Cry 3. In fact, it's pretty much exactly the same in terms of its visual fidelity, only it has been slightly improved to a barely noticeable degree. Things are slightly sharper, slightly more detailed. The animations are mostly the same kind of stuff you saw in Far Cry 3, and there's a lot of asset reuse with regards to the weapons in particular. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because everything in Far Cry 3 in terms of its visuals was pretty high quality, and that is once again the case here. Animations are nice and smooth, they're very fluid, they flow together really well for the most part. There are a few hitches here and there that you will see, but not very many, and they're more glitches than anything else. The environments themselves are very lush, very colorful, and it is greatly appreciated that this game is full of color. Although there is one instance where the color outstays its welcome, and that is the drug-induced missions, where everything gets all psychedelic, and of course the colors go completely bonkers. And it gives you a headache after the first few seconds of it, and these missions can last quite a long time. So spending an entire mission with psychedelic colors waving in and out is actually pretty obnoxious and headache-inducing, and it outstays its welcome very, very quickly. So that gets pretty irritating, but other than that, you're dealing with a high level of visual fidelity with a lot of colors that is very well appreciated, because we still live in an era of brown and gray and realistic. So it's nice to see something vibrant and believable again. And then there's the sound design, which generally is very well done. You've got some very nice beefy sound effects for a lot of the firearms and explosions and such like that, so that's very well appreciated. Some of which was kind of reused from the previous game, Far Cry 3, but it's acceptable in this particular case because the sound effects in that were fairly solid for the most part. And of course several of them did manage to rise above being just solid and ended up being very, very good. And then there's the music, which is fairly solid for the most part, although there were a few tracks here and there that did kind of fall flat. It's just not a particularly memorable soundtrack, even though in the moment it does work rather well. And then there's the licensed tracks they threw along with it, which are all basically South Asian kind of stuff, or at least South Asian inspired stuff. And it definitely works better than Skrillex did in Far Cry 3, which was just obnoxious. But again, it's more of an in-the-moment kind of thing than a truly memorable set of licensed tracks. I mean, a lot of the stuff that they have in the licensed tracks is stuff that pretty much everybody in the West doesn't know. Or if they do know it, it's because it's part of a niche. And so while it's pretty decent stuff for the most part, it's definitely the kind of stuff that we are not used to, and it takes some getting used to in order to actually be able to really get into it. And then there's the voice acting, which for the most part is very, very well done. I mean, the main antagonist of the game, Pagan Min, is voiced by Troy Baker, and he does an excellent job as the character, making him both charming and charismatic, as well as just blatantly crazy and power-hungry. And so he definitely deserves kudos for that, but the rest of the cast does a very good job as well. Nobody is particularly badly played in this thing. At worst, it becomes average. And that's very much in the game's favor because it ultimately has a pretty strong voice cast overall that turn in some very solid performances and make it a surprisingly character-driven game as opposed to a narrative-driven game, at least to some degree, but I'll get to that in a moment. The sound effects combined with the pretty decent soundtrack and the excellent voice acting are good enough on their own as the sound design overall, but when you combine the sound design and the visuals, you have a very, very good presentation that doesn't really have too many horrible technical problems. I did run into some frame rate issues here and there, but generally speaking, it was a pretty smooth running game, although I was cranking all of the settings up, so that could have something to do with why I was having performance issues. But other than a few frame rate issues, I didn't encounter any real stability problems or anything like that, so it earns pretty high marks in terms of presentation. But as good as the presentation is, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you are, I'm just going to say AJ Gale because that's how he pronounces it. Depending on who you're talking to in the game, it is either pronounced AJ or Ajay, and Gale or Gale. Would have been nice had they actually kept something consistent there instead of just having pretty much everybody pronounce a different way. Anyway, you play as this guy, AJ Gale, who has returned to his homeland of Kirat in order to spread his mother's ashes, as he grew up in the U.S. And his bus is stopped at the border by royal troops who proceed to shoot up a lot of people and end up introducing you to the main antagonist of the game, Pagan Min, who it turns out has a sort of familial tie with AJ in that he's a sort of uncle. He and Ishwari, who is AJ's mother, got together when they were younger before Ishwari fled to America. And obviously things happened there, but I don't want to spoil too much of that for you in case you do decide to play through this thing. But suffice to say, pretty early in the game, you are introduced to Pagan as this obviously horrible man who just brutally stabs to death one of his own subordinates right in front of you, then takes a selfie with you. And he takes you off to a palace in order to have a nice dinner, and then he leaves in order to go torture a guy as well as do other things, and you are left with a choice. Do you sit there and wait, or do you try to get the hell out of there? Now, this is where things get kind of interesting because there's actually a secret ending if you do decide to sit there and wait for him. It takes quite a while for him to get back, but eventually he will come back, and there is a special ending with regards to that. So I don't want to spoil that for you, but it was actually kind of interesting, especially considering if you really want to, you can use that to beat the game in about 15 or so minutes. So that's kind of amusing, but if you do what the game pretty much expects you to do, you try to escape, and you eventually end up hooking up with these guys named the Golden Path, who are basically Karat resistance, and they are fighting against Pagan Min's tyranny, and they are split between two different leaders. You have Amita, who is trying to pull Karat into a more modern sensibility, whereas Sabal is trying to preserve what they have in terms of culture and religion and such like that. And this is where the main problem with the game comes in. You see, you learn pretty early on in the game, this isn't really much of a spoiler, both Sabal and Amita are pretty horrible people. And there is no good guy in this game. In fact, the only one vaguely resembling anything you might actually be rooting for is, oddly enough, Pagan Min. Sure, he may be a ruthless, tyrannical dictator, but whenever you run into him in the game, he's actually pretty reasonable. Well, at least to you. He doesn't really have any grudges against you. It's the Golden Path that he hates. And let's face it, he has every reason to hate them. They're guerrilla fighters. They're fighting a war against him. Of course he would hate them. But here's the thing. When your two choices for who to follow are between a woman who basically wants to turn Karat into a drug state and a man who is trying to basically turn Karat into a theocracy, which holds some beliefs that may not be necessarily all that strange for South Asia, but are certainly both strange and actually kind of abhorrent to Westerners, it's not really much of a choice. You're basically just choosing whichever you think is the lesser of two evils at that point. And even though the game does give you a fair amount of choices, they don't really seem to go all that far. Your choice of going with either Amita or Sabal during the missions that require you to choose one or the other do affect the outcome of the story, but they're the only really meaningful choices that you get throughout the game. There are a bunch of other things that are just kind of incidental, and they had an awful lot of opportunity for choice and consequence with some actual role-playing and such, but they didn't really do anything with it. And unfortunately, AJ himself is pretty much a tabula rasa. He has no personality, really. He just kind of gets angry on occasion, but other than that, he's just like, oh, okay, I'll go along with whatever you say, whoever I am going on a mission for right now. And he's also incredibly gullible, because you can go on some missions for Yogi and Reggie, who are two stoners, basically, and they constantly inject him with various drugs, and he falls for it every single time. It's ridiculous. And those two characters themselves feel like they were just thrown in there to have stoner characters in the game, rather than actually being a really integral part of it, because while they do unlock things for the Shangri-La parts of the game, which is basically a dream world kind of thing, where you play as a warrior of Karat named Kalanag, and you are accompanied by a tiger, so you can actually send the tiger out to attack things and such like that. And while the plot within a plot there is relatively fascinating, ultimately the gameplay is what brings that down, because it just tends to drag on and on. It's not so much that it's bad, it's just that it drags. And so what you do get out of the Shangri-La parts of the game is both frustration and a lot of interest, because you have to go through the Yogi and Reggie missions to get to Shangri-La. And the Yogi and Reggie missions are really, really tedious, because they always have you in basically a drug-enhanced stupor, and you're just staggering around doing all sorts of ridiculous things. And then you get to Shangri-La, and you've got supernatural powers. You can order a tiger around to attack these various demons and such like that. And it's interesting, but it does feel like you're basically just retreading ground that was already done in Far Cry 3. And that's another problem that pops up with this game all the friggin' time. You constantly feel like this thing is just kind of traveling in the footsteps of Far Cry 3 rather than actually being its own thing. Because Pagan Min is an obvious attempt to try to recapture the magic of Voss, only they didn't really succeed all that well, partly because Pagan Min himself doesn't really pop up all that much in person. More often than not, he's just talking to you over the radio. And so he doesn't really make much of an antagonist. If anything, he's just kind of a presence there. And whether or not you take him as an antagonist is really up to you, because he never really does anything outright against you, for the most part. It's really his subordinates that are actively going against you. And you harbor ill feelings toward them, but not really toward Pagan Min all that much. He's just kind of there. He says witty things on occasion. He provides a few things of backstory, and that's kind of it. He's not really all that threatening, except for in the very opening cutscene, and after that, he's just kind of eccentric and charming. And then you got everybody else, who are either completely and utterly ridiculous, like, say, Willis, or Yogi and Reggie, and so on and so forth, or they rub you the wrong way, like Amita and Sabal, or they're sort of sympathetic, like Batra or Noor. And Noor is actually one of the antagonists, oddly enough, so the fact that they made her actually sympathetic is at least interesting, even if it is a bit contrived. And then there's AJ and other characters like him who basically have no character. They're just kind of there. AJ just reacts to everything with a sort of, mentality. And it leaves a lot to be desired. So, all of this plot, the characters, the actual mission structures and things like that don't really do all that much for the game. It feels like you're retreading ground at best, and when it does try to do things differently, like with the Amita and Sabal thing, it has very, very mixed results, partly because you can't really get attached to anybody in this game. And it's even weirder considering that the Golden Path is basically portrayed as not being able to do anything without AJ's presence, because they're losing until he shows up and just starts completely and utterly wrecking Pagan Min's forces by himself. and he's constantly being recognized as the son of Mohan, even though he's done basically nothing to earn the respect that his father earned, even if his father was of a, shall we say, questionable moral standing. And all the weird inconsistencies, like AJ saying, "I'm no soldier," after he has mowed down dozens of Pagan Min's troops at that point, just all add up to make a story that is extremely underwhelming. And unlike in Far Cry 3, where when you were playing through the game, you were constantly running into Voss, and he was always just some kind of a threat to you, and he was constantly reinforcing this theme of insanity that the game had, Pagan Min just kind of sits there and does nothing for most of the game, and when he finally does do something, you just go, "That's it? That's it? Okay." And it doesn't really seem to have all that much of an overarching theme tying everything together quite as strongly as Far Cry 3. It's just not anywhere near as well written. And Far Cry 3 wasn't exactly the best written game or anything like that, but it certainly was more consistent and fit together better than Far Cry 4 does. But as underwhelming as the plot and the characters are, what about the actual gameplay? Well, if you've played Far Cry 3, you've basically played Far Cry 4. It's pretty much the exact same game. They changed up a few things here and there. They added in a few new weapons, for example, a few World War II weapons like a broom handle Mauser that has been converted to accept the magazines. So it's basically the M712 Schnellfeuer without the actual Schnellfeuer bit. Or something like the MG42 machine gun, which, yes, it is as ridiculous as it sounds. But apart from more weapons and just more stuff in general, they didn't really do all that much to actually shake up the gameplay. The bigged gameplay addition is a grappling hook, which allows you to scale certain walls or to rappel down certain walls, whether it be cliff sides or actual walls or something like that. Other than that, it's pretty much what you would expect after having played Far Cry 3. It's an open-world FPS in which you run around, you have up to 4 weapons, and you can upgrade things as you go along by crafting things using materials gained from both just scavenging around, whether you find plants for syringes and stuff like that, or you find animal skins for the various holsters and wallets and such like that that you can increase your ammo count with. And that was something that was fairly annoying in Far Cry 3 in the long run, and it's pretty much the exact same case here. It can be kind of annoying in the long run to have to go on these hunting quests in order to get that rare material in order to be able to upgrade your ammo bag all the way or something like that. But one thing you don't really have to worry too much about is the XP system. You get experience points by getting kills, by completing objectives, all sorts of things like that. And when you meet your level threshold, you gain a skill point, which you can then use to purchase various skills from either the tiger or the elephant trees. And the tiger tree is pretty much all offense, while the elephant tree is all support stuff like various syringes, your health capacity, and so on and so forth. And the tiger path is things like different types of takedowns, or being able to reload faster, and all sorts of other things like that. And you find that you gain experience points really quickly, so you're never going to be really lacking for skill points. What you might be lacking instead is money or inventory space. It behooves you to pick up pretty much everything you can in order to actually sell it once you get back to a vendor, in order to get more money so you can buy armor, ammo, syrettes for healing yourself, different weapons if you want, or you can just unlock them by getting enough towers. This time around, instead of radio towers, they are bell towers with radios at the top of them. So the procedure is pretty much the exact same as it was in Far Cry 3, difference being set dressing, and that's pretty much it. Hell, most of the game is like that. It's just a different coat of paint on things that were already done in Far Cry 3. Outpost liberation? It's in here. Hunting side quests? Check. Target quests? Check. It's all very familiar, and if you have played Far Cry 3, you're going to know pretty much every single one of these things, pretty much instinctually at this point. Because the game kind of forced you to go through a lot of the side activities in order to really get access to the majority of the game's content. And this one's kind of no exception in that you really do have to go all over the place and do missions for a lot of different people in order to really get the plot moving. And along the way, you're probably going to be wanting to do a bunch of side activities just so you can get your level up, just so you can get your karma points up, which unlock various bonuses as you increase your karma level. Or for simple things such as money, if you just need more healing surets or ammo or body armor or whatever it may well be. You're always messing around with the side activities, and things can get kind of ridiculous sometimes. For example, when you liberate an outpost, if there is still a fortress in the area, then the outpost will still continue to be overrun by enemies, and you will have to defend it. And I've had so many instances where I did a fast travel to an outpost. As soon as I got out of town, they got attacked. And so I went back and I saved them. And then I go out of town in order to go to where my actual objective is, and sure enough, the town falls under attack again. It's ridiculous. And this emphasis on side activities and side storylines is ultimately what drags this thing down considerably. Because the gunplay is, well, decent enough. I mean, it's Far Cry 3's gunplay, but slightly tweaked. So it's pretty solid stuff for the most part. The AI isn't particularly great. I mean, sometimes they will just create boneheaded situations and then just make themselves incredibly easy targets, but other times they're actually relatively smart. Sometimes, anyway. And they'll use heavy units or berserk rushers, or they'll throw grenades at you in order to really flush you out of cover. But that's, of course, assuming they even find you in the first place, because you do get the opportunity to take advantage of a stealth mechanic system pretty much exactly the same as Far Cry 3's, in that you can crouch and sneak around and it makes you harder to see, and you can take out enemies from the brush or whatever, and either their teammates won't even notice, or if they do notice, they won't immediately go running after you specifically. They'll just start combing the area. And while it isn't the best system around, it certainly works to most degrees, although the instant fail stealth segments that are in the game, just, can we not do that anymore? Can we not have instant fail stealth segments? They're never fun. They're always infuriating no matter what you do. Because you can have a guy just pop up out of nowhere because he spawned in the wrong spot at the wrong time, and instantly fail the mission for you, and you have to start all over again. It gets ridiculous sometimes. And that's actually what happened to me. I was sitting there trying to sneak past a bunch of enemies, and it was constantly failing me because I would get noticed by a guy I hadn't seen. And that was certainly incredibly irritating. But then the game gave me access to elephants, as in rideable elephants that can completely and utterly devastate everything in their path. It's actually pretty glorious. And while it is fun to see what ridiculous amounts of destruction you can cause, the game ultimately ends up being a sandbox without much depth to it. It focuses way too much on the Ubisoft style of side content, where you're constantly having to climb towers of some description in order to fill in parts of your map, capture outposts in order to create new spawn points, capture fortresses if that's a thing, which it is a thing in Far Cry 4. And it's constantly shoving all of these side activities into your face. Whenever you do pretty much anything, it says, "New activities unlocked." Oh joy, yet another hunt where I'm hunting the exact same thing as I hunted before. Or, oh joy, I need to deliver a doohickey by driving to a location, or something like that. And these side activities lose their steam very, very quickly. And that's ultimately the main problem that Far Cry 4 has. It's not a bad game, because it's basically just Far Cry 3 only done much weaker. And so it had a good base to build on, and it did certainly build on that, but it didn't really build enough. It doesn't really feel like Far Cry 4 is its own game. It feels like it's trying to chase what Far Cry 3 did, and is just failing at it. And all the collectibles, the throwaway side activities, the tower climbing, the outpost liberation, all that sort of stuff, just doesn't really have all that much lasting appeal. Sure, it's fine for a while, and if you haven't played Far Cry 3, you'll probably be able to get more out of it than somebody like me who has played Far Cry 3. But the single player leaves a lot to be desired, which is probably why they introduced a co-op system in the single player campaign where you can actually play missions with a buddy. Although I never got to use it because basically nobody I know has Far Cry 4. Or if they do have it, they're not reinstalling it just so I can play co-op with them. And while I can see that being kind of interesting, maybe you do a coordinated assault on a fortress or something like that, it's not really enough to bring the single player up from what it is, which is just a weaker rehash of Far Cry 3. But then we come to the multiplayer, which I was only able to get in a couple games of because there is basically nobody playing this game online anymore. In fact, this is actually what happens fairly often. As you can see, it disconnected me from the game because there were too few players. And that is actually a fairly normal occurrence because there really aren't that many people playing it. It's basically less than 20 people at any given time. Really, it's closer to 10 or less people at any given time. And with an unlock system where you get coins in order to spend them on unlocking weapons and attachments and such like that, you don't really have all that much to really bring you back to the multiplayer, other than the simple fact that it's multiplayer. Because the multiplayer modes that I was in really weren't all that interesting. I mean, you did have some pretty asymmetrical gameplay between the Rakshasa, who are basically hunters. They only get bows, but they can actually charm animals to attack the enemy on their behalf, and whenever they're crouched, they're invisible. And they fight the Golden Path, who in the multiplayer function just basically as your average Far Cry player, in that you get a bunch of different guns, you get a bunch of different classes you can choose from, you unlock a lot of different weapons, from assault rifles to shotguns to LMGs to sniper rifles, whatever you want as your loadout. And you go off and fight the Rakshasa for whatever objective is in the given mode. In the case of what you're seeing here, it's outpost mode, so the Rakshasa are trying to capture the outpost, and the Golden Path are trying to prevent the Rakshasa from capturing it. It's a pretty straightforward mode. The big difference being that there is a bell tower on the map that, while activated, reveals the location of the various Rakshasa units on the minimap, which is kind of a cool idea, and it leads to trying to control the bell tower, but unfortunately the Golden Path have a pretty major advantage. They get sniper rifles, which are ridiculously powerful at really long ranges, far longer ranges than the effective range of the bows that the Rakshasa get. So unless they are ridiculously sneaky, they're probably going to get spotted, and then they're probably going to get sniped. And that can be incredibly infuriating if you're on the receiving end of it. So the multiplayer just ends up being a mess, and is really just kind of a throwaway mode just because, well, the other games had multiplayer, we gotta have multiplayer. So let's try to put an interesting spin on it and fail miserably at it. And that's pretty much what happened. I mean, the multiplayer could have been something interesting, but the way it plays out is just weak, laggy, using matchmaking for the most part, although you do get a server browser if you want. Well, it's not really a server browser, it's a session browser, whatever. But people don't play it for a reason. It's just really not all that fun. And that's ultimately what brings down Far Cry 4 in a nutshell. It's not an outright bad game, it's just not a particularly great one like its predecessors were. Far Cry 3 was a welcome breath of fresh air, and it tried something new and exciting and different. Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon was freaking amazing, because it was just exactly what we needed as far as an FPS went at the time. And even then, it's still just an absolute blast to play that I can easily recommend to anyone. And yet, then you get to Far Cry 4, which is a technically competent game. It plays fine for the most part. And if you liked Far Cry 3, you'll find more of the same here, but with some more content in a different setting. And apart from a much more lackluster story, that's pretty much it. I certainly can't recommend picking it up at full price, but if you get it on a pretty deep discount, then you might be able to get something out of it. But if you're waiting for a discount, then why not just pick up Far Cry 3? It's cheaper, and even though it doesn't have quite the same content as Far Cry 4, nor quite the same polish as Far Cry 4, it's ultimately a much more satisfying experience. Ultimately, I give Far Cry 4 a 3 out of 5. Thanks for watching.